The sun hung low in the sky, casting a somber golden hue over the cemetery. The air was thick with the weight of memories, and the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. A large, black luxury car came to a slow stop by the entrance. Its polished chrome gleamed under the fading light as the door swung open. A tall, well-dressed man stepped out. His face was rugged but handsome, with lines that told the story of a life lived in the fast lane. His gaze was cold, distant. He stood motionless for a moment, looking at the rows of tombstones stretching endlessly before him. This was Thomas Reynolds, the billionaire businessman whose name was known all over the world. His empire spanned continents, his wealth beyond measure. But today, he was not a mogul. Today, he was just a man, walking toward the grave of his daughter, a young woman he had lost far too soon. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he approached the small, unassuming gravestone that bore her name, Emily Reynolds. It had been 3 years since the accident that had taken her life. In that time, Thomas had built empires, expanded his wealth, and fought battles in boardrooms. But none of that mattered now. As he stood before his daughter's grave, the cold business exterior he wore seemed to crack. The tears that had been locked away behind a wall of power and success began to break free. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the pain of losing her. He knelt down by the grave, his hand trembling as it traced her name on the cold stone. The cemetery was empty, save for the few scattered mourners who had come to pay their respects. And yet, just as he was about to speak, a sound caught his attention, a soft sobbing. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder. He turned around. Across the cemetery, under the shadow of a large oak tree, stood a man, a black waiter, dressed in a worn-out suit, his face buried in his hands. The man was sobbing uncontrollably, his body shaking with grief. Beside him stood a small child, perhaps 5 or 6 years old. The child held onto the man's leg, looking up at him with wide eyes, unsure of what was happening. The sight struck Thomas like a bolt of lightning. He hadn't seen anyone else in the cemetery, and yet, there they were. The man, so out of place in such a solemn place, crying with the child at his side. What could he be mourning? The curiosity gnawed at Thomas's mind. Why was this man here? What was his connection to this place? Thomas slowly rose to his feet, his eyes never leaving the scene. He was conflicted. Should he approach them? Should he ignore it? The emotions bubbling inside him were overwhelming. He had never been one to show vulnerability, especially not in public. But today, everything felt different. The wind picked up, swirling around the cemetery, rustling the leaves and stirring the weight of unspoken words in the air. For a moment, Thomas stood there, frozen, watching the black waiter and the child. Then, something in him snapped. He started walking toward them, his footsteps slow and deliberate. As he approached, the man's sobbing grew quieter, but he didn't seem to notice Thomas. The child, sensing something, turned around. Her small face was pale, her eyes wide with innocence, as she looked up at Thomas. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything seemed to stop. The world, the pain, the grief, it all faded away. There was no longer a billionaire and a grieving waiter. There were only two people, connected by a shared sense of loss and sorrow. Thomas stopped a few feet away from the man and the child. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a fleeting moment, he felt like an intruder in a world that wasn't his. The black waiter continued to sob softly, oblivious to Thomas's presence. The child, still clinging to his leg, looked up at him, with eyes filled with a quiet sadness. The man's grief was palpable, and in the stillness of the cemetery, it felt as though his sorrow could be felt by everyone around. Thomas's thoughts raced. He couldn't understand why this man, someone so different from him, was in such anguish. It wasn't as though they shared the same pain, was it? For a moment, Thomas stood motionless, as if trying to decipher the complexity of this situation. He was a man who had always prided himself on controlling everything in his life, his businesses, his finances, his public image. But this was beyond him. The grief of a stranger, a black waiter no less, seemed to rattle him more than it should have. The child's face softened as she stepped forward, breaking the silence. Her small voice was barely audible, yet it pierced through the heavy air. "Is she really gone?" she asked, her gaze drifting toward the grave. The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was a question that Thomas himself had asked 1,000 times since Emily's death. Was she really gone? And if she was, could he ever truly let her go? He hadn't been able to answer it, not fully. And yet, here was this child, asking it with an innocence that Thomas had long since lost. The waiter wiped his eyes, lifting his head just enough to glance at the child. His voice was thick with emotion as he spoke, his words barely more than a whisper. "Yes, sweetheart. She's gone." The words hit Thomas like a blow to the chest. He felt a lump form in his throat, but he fought it down. He wasn't supposed to be moved by this. He wasn't supposed to care. And yet, he did. The child nodded solemnly, her tiny hand slipping into the waiter's. "I don't want her to be gone. I want her to come back." The waiter let out a breath, as if he had been holding it in for far too long. "I know, sweetie. I know." Thomas watched them for a moment longer, unable to tear himself away. He could feel the connection between the two of them, their shared pain, their grief, their longing for something they could never have. In that moment, he realized that grief had no boundaries. It didn't care about wealth or status or race. It didn't care about who you were or what you had. Grief was universal. The man, seeing Thomas standing there, looked up at him. There was something in his gaze, perhaps confusion, perhaps recognition, but it was brief. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and then, without saying a word, turned back toward the grave. For a moment, Thomas felt as though he had intruded, as though he wasn't welcome. But then, the waiter did something that surprised him. He reached out and, with a tentative motion, patted the ground next to him. The message was clear: sit, be with us. Without fully understanding why, Thomas sat down beside the man, the child, now resting her head on the waiter's shoulder. They were strangers. Two men who had lived completely different lives, who had experienced different things. And yet, for this brief moment, they were connected by the same thread of grief that ran through them both. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt more like an unspoken understanding, a mutual respect for the weight they each carried. The wind began to pick up again, swirling around them in soft gusts, as if nature itself was mourning alongside them. Thomas glanced at the gravestone. Emily Reynolds, his daughter. The pain of her loss hit him again, a familiar ache that never quite went away. It had been 3 years, and yet it felt as though it had just happened yesterday. He had buried his grief under layers of work, of business meetings, of endless deals and transactions. But here, now, in the presence of this man and his child, it all came rushing back. He thought about his daughter, her smile, her laughter, the way she lit up a room. He remembered her passion for life, her love for the arts, her ability to see beauty in everything. And then he remembered the accident, the call, the frantic rush to the hospital, and then ... nothing. She was gone. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. The tears that he had kept bottled up for so long threatened to escape, but he fought them back. He couldn't cry here. Not in front of this stranger. Not when he had spent so many years building a fortress around his emotions. The waiter, sensing the turmoil within Thomas, spoke softly. "I know how you feel. The loss, it never really goes away. You just learn to carry it." Thomas turned to him, surprised by the man's words. You ... you understand." The waiter nodded, his expression somber. "I do. I lost someone too. A long time ago." For the first time, Thomas saw the full weight of the waiter's grief. It wasn't just the sorrow of today. It was the sorrow of years. The deep, abiding pain that never quite healed. "You never really get over it, do you?" Thomas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "No," the waiter replied, his eyes clouded with memories. "But you learn to live with it. You find a way to keep going, even when it feels impossible." Thomas nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle in his chest. He had spent so many years running from his grief, refusing to face it. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. Time to face the pain head-on, and learn how to carry it with grace. Like this man beside him, the child shifted slightly, her small hand still resting in the waiter's. "Do you miss her too?" she asked, looking up at Thomas with innocent eyes. For a moment, Thomas was taken aback. But then he looked at her, at the purity of her question, and he nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "I miss her every day." As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the cemetery, Thomas listened as the waiter began to tell his story. The man's voice was low, full of sorrow, but there was a quiet strength in it. "I lost my wife, Olivia," he began, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We were just starting out, making plans, building a life together. We had a dream of family. But then, one night, she was gone. Just like that. An accident." Thomas felt a pang of understanding. Another life lost. Another dream shattered. It seemed like the world was full of stories like this, each one a different version of the same grief. The waiter continued, his voice growing softer as he spoke of Olivia, her smile, her kindness, the way she had cared for him and the world around her. I was devastated, he said, his words cracking with emotion. But there was something else too, a gift she left behind. My daughter, she's all I have left of her. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He knew what it was like to lose someone, but hearing the waiter speak of his daughter, it made him realize how lucky he was to have had the chance to be a father to Emily, even if it was brief. And now, the waiter said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, I'm doing everything I can to give her a life her mother would have wanted for her. I have to keep going. For her. Thomas looked at the small child, who had fallen asleep on the waiter's shoulder. Her peaceful face, unaware of the sorrow her father carried. She was the reason he kept going. She was the reason he woke up every day and faced the world. As the evening sky deepened into a rich purple, Thomas sat silently, reflecting on everything he had heard. The man beside him, his grief, his love for his daughter, it was a revelation. Thomas had spent years in a world of opulence and power, but it had never truly fulfilled him. Now, sitting here with a stranger, he understood that the most valuable things in life weren't wealth, or status, or success. It was love. It was family. It was the people you cared about. The waiter glanced at Thomas, his eyes weary. I know you probably don't want to hear this, he said quietly, but I want you to know something. Thomas looked at him, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. Don't let the grief consume you, the waiter continued. It will, but you have to fight it. You have to keep living. For the ones you lost. Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of those words. He had spent so many years running, numbing the pain with work and distractions. But now, he realized that he had to let it go. Let go of the pain, the guilt, the grief, and learn to live again. The cemetery was quiet now, the sun having disappeared behind the horizon, leaving only the faint glow of twilight. Thomas stood up, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in years. The waiter and the child stood with him, both of them, silent, but there was an unspoken connection between them now. The three of them, strangers just hours before, had shared something deep, something that would never fade. I think it's time, Thomas said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything he had learned that day. The waiter nodded, giving him a solemn smile. Yes, it's time. As Thomas turned to leave, he looked back at the grave one last time, and for the first time in years, he felt something that had been missing.